In 1981, 2,500 workers in West Belfast, Catholic and Protestant, entering through separate gates, built stainless steel gull-wing sports cars on a factory floor that had been peat bog 3 years earlier. £77 million of British taxpayers' money, the most advanced car factory in Europe, rising from the most violent corner of it. Then the founder bought a 430-acre estate while the company bled cash. Millions vanished into a Panamanian shell company, an FBI sting, a suitcase of cocaine, an arrest in a Los Angeles hotel room. The factory gates locked overnight. Today, the building produces aluminium components. No plaque, no memorial. The test track survives, circled once a year by enthusiasts driving cars now worth more than the houses the workers went home to. This is the story of John DeLorean, the son of a Romanian immigrant who reinvented himself into the most glamorous man in American industry, walked away from a $650,000 salary, and persuaded a desperate government to build him a dream on a swamp. It cost the workers everything. It cost him nothing he hadn't already spent. Chapter 1. The Son of the Furnace. The story doesn't begin in Belfast. It begins where all American reinvention begins, in the place you're desperate to escape. 17,199 Mark Street, near 6 Mile Road and Dequindre on Detroit's Near East Side, roughly a mile from the Ford Motor Company plant in Highland Park. A lower middle-class neighbourhood in a city built on the certainty that making things with your hands was the surest path to a decent life. Zachary DeLorean, born Zachariah DeLorean, had come alone from Shugag, a farming village in the Transylvanian hills of Romania. Youngest of 13 children. He'd crossed an ocean at roughly 20 years old, speaking no English, and found work as a millwright and foundry worker at the Ford plant. His wife, Catherine Prebach, a Hungarian immigrant, worked at General Electric's Carbaloy Products division. Between them, they earned enough to keep 4 sons fed, clothed, after a fashion, and housed. John, the eldest, born January the 6th, 1925, later recalled that his mother sewed the boys' clothes from grain sacks. It wasn't poverty that shaped John Zachary DeLorean, it was violence. Zachary Sr. was an alcoholic whose rages drove Catherine to periodically take the boys to live with her sister in Los Angeles. The parents divorced in 1942 when John was 17. His father moved to a boarding house, became estranged from his sons, and descended into drug addiction. He died in obscurity. His eldest son would spend the rest of his life building a version of himself that bore no resemblance to the man who'd raised him, down to the bones of his own face. But that came later. First, there was escape through the only route available to a bright kid from the Near East Side: education. DeLorean attended Cass Technical High School, a prestigious Detroit institution reserved for honor students, and played saxophone in mixed-race jazz clubs at night. He won a scholarship to the Lawrence Institute of Technology, where he studied industrial engineering. Drafted into the US Army in 1943, he served 3 years without going overseas. After discharge, he worked as a draftsman for Detroit's Public Lighting Commission for 18 months, not for the career, but to stabilize his family's finances. He completed his engineering degree in 1948. Then a master's in automotive engineering from the Chrysler Institute in 1952, then an MBA from the University of Michigan, attending night classes while working full-time. Between degrees, he sold life insurance, $850,000 worth in 10 months. The man could sell anything. That would prove to be both the making of him and the undoing of everyone who believed him. He joined the Packard Motor Company in 1953, improved their Ultramatic transmission, and became head of research and development within 3 years. In 1956, General Motors engineering vice president Oliver K. Kelly offered DeLorean his pick of any division. He chose Pontiac, then GM's stodgiest brand, as assistant to chief engineer Pete Estes under general manager Simon Bunky Knudsen. It was, by any rational measure, a strange choice. But DeLorean didn't want a prestigious division. He wanted one he could transform. And transform it he did. Over the next several years, DeLorean produced dozens of patented innovations. concealed windscreen wipers, overhead cam engines, the lane change indicator, the elastomeric Endura bumper, wide track wheels. He was promoted to Assistant Chief Engineer in 1959, then Division Chief Engineer in 1961, at the age of 36. But it was an act of quiet corporate rebellion that made him famous. Chapter 2. The Man Who Invented the Muscle Car. In early 1963, General Motors banned all divisions from involvement in motor racing. At informal Saturday sessions at the Milford Proving Grounds, DeLorean, Bill Collins, Director of Advanced Engineering, and Russ G., Head of Experimental, devised a way around it. Collins suggested dropping a 389 cubic inch V8 from the full-sized Grand Prix into the smaller Tempest body. DeLorean's response was 2 words: let's try it. The running prototype took a week. GM policy. Limited intermediate cars to a 330 cubic inch maximum engine, but only for standard engines. By offering the bigger motor as an option package, DeLorean circumvented the rule entirely. He named it GTO, after the Ferrari 250 GTO, which must have delighted the Italians. Advertising Vice President Jim Wangers proved so effective that 5,000 dealer orders were placed before GM's corporate office even knew the car existed. Production began the 3rd of September 1963. Nearly 250,000 units sold in its first 5 years. The American muscle car movement, every Chevelle, every Charger, every Boss Mustang that followed, traces its lineage directly to a Saturday afternoon at Milford and a man who said, let's try it. At 40, DeLorean became the youngest division head in the history of the world's largest corporation. He oversaw the Pontiac Firebird. He redesigned the Grand Prix so completely that sales leapt from 32,000 to over 112,000 units. On the 15th of February, 1969, he was promoted to head of Chevrolet, GM's largest division, with annual sales exceeding $10 billion. By 1971, Chevrolet hit record sales of more than 3 million vehicles, nearly matching the entire Ford Motor Company. A year later, he was elevated to Group Vice President of all North American car and truck operations. $25 billion in sales. A salary of over $650,000 a year. And somewhere in the middle of all this, John DeLorean rebuilt himself. He lost 60 pounds, started lifting weights, began draping his 6'4" frame in brightly coloured shirts, turtlenecks, and nipped-at-the-waist suits. He dyed his hair, grew rock star sideburns, and underwent plastic surgery, specifically a chin implant. He told Fortune magazine it was reconstructive surgery after a racing accident at Lime Rock. Fortune checked with the track owner, who recalled neither the accident nor DeLorean ever driving there. The Detroit Free Press ran a blind gossip item about an auto executive getting surgery to look like the Pepsi generation. Hollywood producer Pierre Cosette looked at the finished product and said he looked like he'd been put together by the property department of MGM. He drove to work blasting Jefferson Airplane. On Thursday nights, he'd commandeer a GM corporate jet from Detroit to Los Angeles, party through the weekend, and fly back Monday night. He dated Ursula Andress, Raquel Welch, Candice Bergen. His friends included Johnny Carson, Sammy Davis Jr., and Steve McQueen. He owned stakes in the San Diego Chargers and the New York Yankees. His second wife was Kelly Harmon. She was 19, he was 44. And Ford President Lee Iacocca was his best man. The son of a Romanian foundry worker who couldn't speak English had remade himself into the most glamorous executive in American industry. He'd also made himself intolerable to General Motors' grey-suited corporate culture. On the 2nd of April, 1973, he announced he was leaving. Publicly, "I want to do things in the social area." Privately, insiders said he was given the choice of leaving voluntarily or being fired. His book, On a Clear Day You Can See General Motors, sold 1.6 million copies and exposed GM's culture of mediocrity and waste. He was 48 years old. He had the fame, the connections, the reputation, and, crucially, the unshakable belief that he could do what no one had successfully done in half a century: build a new American car company from nothing. He called it an ethical sports car. Rationally sized, durable, fuel-efficient, safe. The car the post-OPEC world needed. He recruited Bill Collins from Pontiac as chief engineer and commissioned Giorgetto Giugiaro of Ital Design to style the exterior. Collins completed the first prototype by October 1976. The DeLorean Motor Company was incorporated the 24th of October 1975 in Detroit. The dream had a shape. Now it needed a home. And the home it found, against all logic, against all advice, against every instinct of caution, was a peat bog in the most violent corner of Western Europe. Chapter 3. The Hammer Blow. By 1978, Northern Ireland was in its 10th year of the Troubles. More than 2,000 people had been killed. West Belfast's male unemployment stood at roughly 40 to 50%, the highest in Western Europe. The traditional industries were in catastrophic decline. Harland and Wolff shipbuilding had fallen from 30,000 employees to around 10,000. The linen industry had shrunk by 2/3 in 25 years. In 1976 alone, 2,600 jobs were lost to 31 manufacturing closures. Foreign investment was virtually non-existent, and with good reason. The Grundig electronics factory in Dunmurry, a short distance from the site DeLorean would eventually choose, had seen its manager, Thomas Niedermeyer, kidnapped and murdered by the Provisional IRA on the 27th of December 1973. Into this landscape stepped Roy Mason, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland under Prime Minister James Callaghan. Mason was a blunt former Yorkshire coal miner who saw DeLorean's proposal as something far beyond a business deal. He told Callaghan the factory could save soldiers' lives. The logic was straightforward. Give people 2,000 jobs, you give them hope. Give them hope, and they have less cause to support the paramilitaries. Roy Hattersley, Secretary of State for Prices, later captured the political pressure precisely. Roy Mason put it in such a way that to turn DeLorean down seemed like abandoning Northern Ireland and its economy. BBC. Northern Ireland correspondent Jeremy Paxman stripped the rationale to its bones. People who have jobs don't spend all their time rioting and fighting and scheming. A Toronto-based investment bank contacted the Northern Ireland Department of Commerce in June 1978, suggesting they meet DeLorean. From first contact to signed master agreement took 46 days. 46 days to commit roughly £53 million of public money. Approximately $17.8 million in equity, $18.7 million in grants, $6.7 million in loans, $9.75 million in employment grants, to a man whose personal investment would total approximately $390,000. Against a projected start-up cost of $200 million, the British government was covering 60%. The warnings were there. Sir Kenneth Cork, chairman of the Northern Ireland Development Agency, was sceptical of the proposal. He was overruled by Mason and Minister of State Don Concannon. HM Treasury had doubts, overruled by the Northern Ireland Office's political urgency. The government's own consultant reportedly assessed the scheme as an extraordinarily risky venture, with chances of success remote. Most tellingly, the Republic of Ireland's Industrial Development Authority had conducted proper due diligence on the identical proposal and rejected it. Minister for Industry. Desmond O'Malley refused, calling it all too good to be true. He was right. But being right didn't matter. DeLorean had been playing Northern Ireland, the Republic, and Puerto Rico against each other for months. Puerto Rico had offered $60 million at Ramey Air Force Base. DeLorean switched to Belfast just hours after US departments approved $40 million in loans for the Puerto Rico deal, prompting threats of legal action. Mason admitted, after the collapse, that he had skimped details because of time pressure. The master agreement was signed the 28th of July 1978. The site: 72 acres of marshland and peat bog, at the Cuts, Dunmurry, on Belfast's southwestern edge. roughly 6 miles from the city centre. Strategically situated between the Republican Twinbrook estate and the Unionist Dunmurry and Seymour Hill estates, with 2 gates deliberately built for cross-community recruitment. Bobby Sands, who would lead the 1981 hunger strike, had been living in Twinbrook before his arrest. One man's charisma had talked 2 governments into building him a car factory in a war zone. Groundbreaking came in October 1978. Chapter 4. A Factory from the Bog. The speed of what followed was, by any measure, extraordinary. 6 buildings totalling 660,000 square feet rose on reclaimed bogland in 16 months. The transition from peat bog to producing factory took 28 months, including equipment installation. The architects were Gerald Mooney of Brodie and Hawthorne in Belfast. The builders were Farrans, McLaughlin and Harvey. Local folk tales would later attribute DeLorean's failure to the destruction of a sacred fairy fort during construction. Given what followed, you'd struggle to call the superstitious unreasonable. But before the fairy fort's curse, if curse it was, there was the engineering problem. DeLorean needed someone to turn his prototype into a production car, and the obvious candidates wanted nothing to do with it. Porsche declined. BMW declined. DeLorean turned to Colin Chapman of Lotus Cars. Initially offered $12 million, Chapman said no. At $17.65 million, his accountant Fred Bushell convinced him to accept, with one condition: the funds must be paid up front into Chapman's offshore company, GPD Services, registered in Panama with nothing but a Geneva postal address. No offices, no real assets. Operated by the wife of a former racing driver named Jerry Juhan. That money, and where it actually went, would become the financial time bomb at the heart of the entire story. But in 1978, it was simply the cost of getting Lotus on board. Chapman's engineers essentially rebuilt the car. Bill Collins's original design had used unproven technologies. Elastic reservoir moulding for the chassis, airbags, 10-mile-per-hour bumpers. Lotus replaced nearly everything with proven methods: a steel backbone chassis from GKN Sankey in Bilston, Esprit-derived suspension, conventional construction. Collins was forced out of the company in early 1979. "I was upset with John," he said later. "He forced me to resign. I think he was happy to see me go." The production car that emerged was a strange and compromised thing. Under the skin, a 2.8 5-litre PRV V6, jointly developed by Peugeot, Renault and Volvo, built in Douvrin, France. 130 horsepower in American specification. On the outside, brushed stainless steel, SAE 304 austenitic grade, and manufactured by August Lappel in Carlow, Ireland, and trucked 128 panels per load to Belfast. Gull-wing doors supported by cryogenically preset torsion bars developed by Grumman Aerospace, and nitrogen-charged struts by Umbraco. Giugiaro's exterior, drawn from his earlier Porsche Tapiro concept, remained largely intact. Every car left the factory unpainted, the bare steel its only finish. The internal designation DMC12 derived from the original target retail price, $12,000. The actual launch price would be $25,000. But that reckoning was still to come. Now it needed workers. Chapter 5. The Oasis. They came through 2 gates. That mattered. The Dunmurry gate served the Protestant estates, Seymour Hill, Dunmurry proper. The Twinbrook gate served the Catholic neighbourhoods where Bobby Sands had lived, where unemployment ran at levels that made the rest of Belfast's grim statistics look generous. 2 communities that had spent a decade learning to fear each other, walking through separate entrances to build the same car, side by side, on the same factory floor. At peak, approximately 2,500 workers were employed. Many had never held a job before. One worker, interviewed years later, put it simply: "I had my own car, but that's the only experience I ever had with cars." Several hundred pre-production cars, fiberglass-bodied black cars, were built as training vehicles, while Lotus engineers embedded themselves alongside the Belfast workforce, teaching assembly methods developed in Norfolk to men and women whose previous experience of the automotive industry was limited to driving. The wages were informed by American factory standards, vastly better than anything on offer elsewhere in Belfast. For workers from communities where a wage packet was not a weekly certainty but a rare event, the DeLorean factory represented something more profound than employment. Writer Glenn Patterson, who interviewed former workers for a BBC radio play, found something consistent in every conversation. The workers, to a man and woman, and the and woman was important, looked on their days at DeLorean as among the happiest of their working lives. For some, in one of the blackest of unemployment spots of Western Europe, they were the only working days of their lives. Mechanic David Winnington described the factory as an oasis, a place where Protestant and Catholic workers could escape sectarian tension. Inside those walls, the troubles didn't disappear, but they receded enough for something fragile and remarkable to take shape. People who'd grown up on opposite sides of peace lines worked adjacent stations, ate in the same canteen, shared the peculiar pride of building something no one else in the world was building. A stainless steel gull-wing sports car, designed in Italy, engineered in England, powered by a French engine, and assembled by their hands on reclaimed bogland in West Belfast. DeLorean himself, visiting in January 1981, spoke with an intensity that even his critics acknowledged was genuine in that moment. I think originally we came up here, we were just businessmen doing a business deal. Now all of us have become so infected with the absolute mandatory requirement that this project be successful, that we're really more interested in making it successful from the standpoint of the people than we are from any personal standpoint. And by God, it's going to be successful. The first car, VIN 500, was completed on Sunday the 18th of January, 1981. The rehearsal drive didn't go quite as planned. Mike Foxon drove it off the line and straight into a stack of empty cages in the yard. Photographer Esla Crawford had been hired to capture the moment. He captured a different one. DeLorean visited 3 days later on the 21st of January, by which time 10 cars had been completed. That date is typically cited as the official start of production. By mid-1981, the factory was producing approximately 175 cars per week. More than 340 American dealerships had signed up, many with $5,000 deposits from eager buyers. Over 1,600 men were working 6 or 7 day weeks. Johnny Carson had invested $500,000 and received an early car, VIN 2439, which famously broke down on its first outing due to electrical failure. Sammy Davis Jr. invested $150,000. In total, 132 investors put over $18.7 million into DeLorean's limited research partnership. 3 cars were plated in 24-karat gold for an American Express promotion at $85,000 each. Only 2 sold. October 1981 was the single best month for sales, 720 vehicles. The factory was humming, the workforce was proud, the car was on television, in magazines, in showrooms from California to Connecticut. Barry Wills, director of purchasing at Dunmurry, reached for a comparison that only a Belfast man would make. The ship and the car were both failures, but they were both glorious failures. Placing the DeLorean alongside the Titanic as the city's most magnificent industrial disaster. He just didn't know yet how right he'd be. Chapter 6. The Summit and the Cliff. 720 cars sold in October. That was the summit, the highest point the DeLorean Motor Company would ever reach. And standing at that summit, almost no one inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off. The problems had been there from the beginning, compounding beneath the surface like stress fractures in a hull. The early production cars were, by any honest assessment, embarrassingly shoddy. Body panels that didn't align. Gull-wing doors that stuck or leaked. Alternators too weak to charge the battery, leaving owners stranded. cold start switch malfunctions, oil and coolant leaks, faulty spark plug wires, noisy camshafts, sticking throttles, suspension misalignment causing premature tyre wear, and a detail that captures the comprehensive nature of the quality failure: dye from the floor mats rubbed off onto drivers' shoes. The first car produced reportedly drove straight into a wall due to brake failure. Early production cars needed as much as 200 hours of rework at quality assurance centres before being shipped to dealerships, later reduced to 68 hours at $600 per car in additional costs. 3 QACs operated across the United States: Santa Ana in California, Bridgewater in New Jersey, and Troy in Michigan. Workers there were nicknamed POGs, look like pigs, work like dogs. The Troy Centre alone logged 6,114 parts. Usage entries across 1,016 cars. Some individual vehicles had parts lists suggesting only 60% of the car was actually assembled in Dunmurry, with the remaining 40% finished at the QAC. And then there was the price. The car that was supposed to retail for $12,000 launched at $25,000, rose to $29,825, and eventually reached $34,000, equivalent to roughly $89,000 to $110,000 in today's money. At $25,000, the DeLorean was 25% more expensive than a Chevrolet Corvette, a Datsun 280ZX Turbo, or a Porsche 924 Turbo, all of which were significantly faster. Road and Track magazine measured the 0 to 60 time at 10.5 seconds. DeLorean claimed 8.8. Road and Track's verdict was blunt. It's not a barn burner. Frankly, that's not quick for a sports car in this price category. At its final price of $34,000, the DeLorean sat in Porsche 911 territory with the performance of a family saloon. The American recession of 1981 to 82, with sky-high interest rates, devastated luxury car demand. An unusually severe northeastern winter, DeLorean's primary market, further depressed sales. Banks cancelled dealers' floor plan financing, and the competition didn't share the DeLorean's problems. BMW and Mercedes US sales more than doubled between 1980 and 86. Porsche nearly tripled. The DeLorean, positioned as neither a true performance car nor a practical luxury GT, fell between every crack in the market. After October's 720, sales crashed to 350 by January 1982. By the end of 1981, the factory had produced approximately 7,500 cars. It had sold roughly 3,000. More than half of every DeLorean ever built remained unsold. Break-even required 10 to 12,000 units per year. The factory never came close. Despite falling demand, DeLorean doubled production output rather than reducing it, against the advice of managing director Don Lander and other executives. In March 1982, telegrams were sent to all 343 dealerships requesting each buy 6 cars. Not a single dealership responded with a sales order. The summit had lasted weeks, not years, and the cliff was already beneath their feet. Chapter 7. Other people's money. The money was always other people's money. That was the thing. John DeLorean's personal investment in the company that bore his name totaled approximately $390,000. Against a startup cost of $200 million, the British taxpayer covered roughly $120 million, 60% of the entire venture. The remaining funds came from American investors, limited research partnerships, and dealer deposits. DeLorean risked almost nothing of his own. He risked everything of theirs. And while the factory in Dunmurry was hemorrhaging cash, while unsold cars accumulated on dealer lots across America, while the workforce that had crossed sectarian lines to build his dream was about to be sent home, John DeLorean was living in a manner that suggested the crisis was happening to someone else entirely. His property portfolio, assembled during the company's brief existence, told its own story. A $7.2 million 20-room duplex on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. A $3.5 million 430-acre estate in Bedminster, New Jersey. Purchased just 4 months after the first car rolled off the line. One of the largest residential property deals in New Jersey history. A $4 million ranch in Palmer Valley, California. His estimated net worth at the time, $28 million. His salary from DMC, approximately $500,000 a year with generous expenses. Christina Ferrare and other top executives drew salaries exceeding $300,000. He maintained expensive New York headquarters, used corporate jets extensively, and employed a psychic named Sonia. At his later trial, it was alleged he'd altered a Beverly Wilshire lunch receipt from $17 to $191.50. A line of DeLorean-branded men's toiletries was reportedly in development while the factory burned through its last reserves. The Bedminster estate is the detail that settles in the stomach. 4 months after the first car, 430 acres, $3.5 million, while 2,500 workers in West Belfast, many of whom had never held a job before, for whom this factory represented the first and perhaps only wage packet of their lives, were building his cars 6 and 7 days a week. Walter Stricker, the company's finance chief, was asked years later to characterize his former boss. He reached for fiction. I would say closer to being a gecko. Gordon Gekko. The man who said greed was good. Stricker had watched from the inside. He chose that comparison deliberately. The cash flow crisis had been building since the company's first full year of operation. DMC entered 1981 with an $18.6 million shortfall, despite a last-minute £24 million government infusion in late 1980. By late 1981, DMC America stopped paying DMC Limited in Belfast for cars already delivered, owing approximately $10 million, leaving the Belfast subsidiary unable to pay its own suppliers. In the third week of January 1982, the Bank of America credit line was exhausted. On the 28th of January, they withdrew export cover entirely. 1,100 workers were made redundant in January 1982. 1,100 from a workforce of 2,600 overnight. The hunger strikes of 1981 had already tested the factory's fragile cross-community peace. Half the workforce staged an impromptu walkout after Bobby Sands began his hunger strike. Workers devised a banner showing a DeLorean car smashing through a giant H for H blocks. When Sands' body was returned to Twinbrook, a riot erupted. British Army forces chased rioters towards the Dunmurry plant. A hijacked car was driven through the outer gates. Homemade bombs destroyed company records, computer terminals, and engineering data that took weeks to recreate. The factory had survived the troubles. It wouldn't survive its own founder. Chapter 8. The Money That Went Walkabout. The fraud at the heart of the DeLorean story has a name, and the name is GPD Services Incorporated. Remember that offshore company, registered in Panama, with nothing but a Geneva postal address, no physical offices, no real assets. Operated by the wife of former racing driver Jerry Juhan. Originally established by Colin Chapman and Fred Bushell as Grand Prix drivers, a vehicle for evading high British taxes. That company became the mechanism through which millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money simply disappeared. Under the 1978 deal for Lotus to re-engineer the DMC-12, DeLorean transferred $17.65 million to GPD. Of that, $5.1 million came directly from DMC Limited, which is to say, from the British taxpayer. The remainder came from American research partnerships. A further £11.5 million was paid to GPD between April 1979 and December 1981, ostensibly for technical development. None of this money reached Lotus, not a penny. Lotus billed DMC Limited directly for its actual engineering work, approximately $23 million. The GPD payments were entirely separate. They were, in the bluntest possible terms, theft. The money was divided. DeLorean took approximately half, around $8.5 million. Chapman took roughly 45%. Fred Bushell received approximately 5%. Sir Kenneth Cork, appointed receiver after the collapse, described the $17.67 million with characteristic understatement. It had gone walkabout. The two directors placed on the DMC board by the Northern Ireland Development Agency, the men specifically tasked with protecting taxpayer interests, were supposed to be the safeguard against precisely this kind of fraud. Instead, they were later revealed to have been behind a £400,000 bonus deal for DeLorean executives. The watchdogs had been captured by the company they were meant to watch. DeLorean controlled the transfer price, what DMC Michigan paid DMC Belfast per car, meaning he controlled the flow of profits between the two entities. The structure was, in hindsight, purpose-built for extraction. And the Conservative government, despite its philosophical opposition to industrial subsidies, kept funding the project after inheriting it in May 1979. Secretary of State Humphrey Atkins approved an additional £14 million in grants in September 1980 and a £10 million bank guarantee in July 1981. Each tranche was justified on the same grounds. Closing the factory would waste the previous investment and cost 2,500 jobs in a region the government couldn't afford to abandon politically. DeLorean was, as one account noted, fond of telling colleagues in New York that he had the British government over a barrel. Academic researcher Graham Brownlow of Queen's University Belfast later argued that DeLorean engaged in binge recruiting, cynically hiring more workers to increase the political cost of closure. When DeLorean came back requesting another £35 million in late 1981, Margaret Thatcher finally drew a line. She would approve further funding only if DeLorean could find matching private investment. He couldn't. A planned stock issue, the DeLorean Motors Holding Company, expected to raise $27 million, was cancelled after the Securities and Exchange Commission raised questions about viability. Secretary of State James Pryor's suspicions deepened when DeLorean cited GEC, the General Electric Company, as a possible backer. Pryor knew GEC's chief executive Arnold Weinstock personally. He telephoned him. Weinstock told Pryor he had never met DeLorean. The lie was that brazen and that careless. On the 19th of February 1982, Pryor announced the receivership in the House of Commons. DMC was over $800,000 in arrears on interest payments. Suppliers, including Renault, were threatening legal action. Pryor appointed Sir Kenneth Cork and Paul Shewell of Cork Gully, part of Coopers and Lybrand, as receivers. Cork was Britain's most famous insolvency practitioner, a former Lord Mayor of London, chairman of the Royal Shakespeare Company. He was, crucially, neither charmed nor intimidated by DeLorean. Cork initially envisaged a constructive receivership lasting 4 to 6 weeks. He allowed reduced production to continue from February to May 1982, producing roughly 1,000 additional cars. The remaining 1,500 workers clung to the hope that a buyer, an investor, someone might step forward and save what was left. Cork set a deadline. DeLorean must raise at least £10 million by October 1982, or the factory would close permanently. Chapter 9. The consortium that never was. There was briefly a plan that might have worked. A consortium led by Barry Wills, the longest-serving DMC employee, the man who'd compared the venture to the Titanic, along with Charles Chuck Bennington, the former first managing director of DMC Limited, and L.E. Bill Bellamy, chairman of CP Trim, proposed something genuinely credible. Rename the company Dunmurry Motor Company. License the Healey name from Donald Healey. Take over production of a facelifted Triumph, TR7 and TR8, alongside a turbocharged DMC-12. Production targets 3,500 DeLoreans and 7,500 TR7s and TR8s annually. DeLorean's name, now toxic in the City of London, would be minimised to the point of invisibility. Cork called it the first sensible business plan I have seen for saving the factory. He gave it his full support. James Pryor and the Northern Ireland office agreed to guarantee an £80,000 fee for merchant bank Hill Samuel to conduct due diligence. But the decision wasn't Pryor's alone. Margaret Thatcher vetoed the plan. Barry Wills recalled being told that, "While James Pryor remained very much in favour of our plan, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was not." The reasoning was never made fully public. By this point, the DeLorean name had become synonymous with government humiliation, the most expensive industrial failure in Northern Ireland's history, a standing rebuke to any politician foolish enough to bet public money on a charismatic salesman's promises. Thatcher, who had reluctantly inherited the project and watched it consume tens of millions more on her watch, was not prepared to roll the dice again. Whether the consortium would have succeeded is unknowable. What is known is that it was the last credible proposal to keep production running and workers employed at Dunmurry. When it died, so did the factory's last realistic hope. And then, on the 19th of October 1982, the question became academic. Chapter 10. Better than gold. The man who brought DeLorean down was himself a convicted criminal. James Timothy Hoffman, born Timothy William de Jong in Grand Haven, Michigan, son of a minister, was a pilot and aerial surveyor turned aircraft salesman who had drifted into drug smuggling. Arrested in San Diego County in September 1981 on 4 counts of cocaine trafficking, he pleaded guilty to 1 count and agreed to work as an FBI informant in exchange for 5 years probation. He received over $179,000 from the government for his cooperation and was later enrolled in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Judge Takasugi would eventually call him a hired gun. Hoffman was a former neighbor of DeLorean's in Palmer Valley, California. They'd first met in approximately April 1978. In July 1982, with DeLorean desperate to raise the capital Cork had demanded, Hoffman contacted DeLorean's New York offices with an unsolicited offer to help raise $15 million from offshore investors. DeLorean's secretary, Carol Winkler, kept detailed call logs. They would prove that Hoffman made the initial call. That fact would later save DeLorean's freedom. Over July to October 1982, the scheme morphed. What began as finding investors became, meeting by meeting, tape by tape, a cocaine deal. On the 11th of July, DeLorean met Hoffman at the Marriott Hotel in Newport Beach. On the 8th of September, FBI agent Benedict Tisa, posing as a banker named James Benedict, met DeLorean at a bank in San Carlos, California. On the surveillance recording, Tisa told DeLorean about an investor whose money came from cocaine deals. DeLorean's reply, "It looks like a good opportunity." By this point, DMC was $175 million in debt. More than half of the 7,000 cars produced remained unsold. Cork's deadline was weeks away. DeLorean's last credible investor, Manhattan developer Peter Kalikow, had pulled out in late May. Before going to the final meeting, DeLorean wrote a letter to his lawyer, sealed it, with instructions it should only be opened if he did not return. He later claimed he didn't know Hoffman's scheme involved drugs until it was too late. The letter was, depending on your reading, either a desperate man's insurance policy or a calculated alibi. The 19th of October, 1982. Suite 501 of the Sheraton Plaza Hotel, near Los Angeles International Airport. The proposed deal. DeLorean would serve as financier for the purchase and resale of 220 pounds of cocaine, 100 kilograms, with an estimated street value of $24 million. Hoffman picked DeLorean up at LAX. In the hotel room were Hoffman, FBI, agent Benedict Tisa as James Benedict, and another agent posing as Jerry West. The room was wired for audio and video. A suitcase sat on the table. It was opened. Inside, 55 pounds of cocaine, 25 kilograms, worth approximately $6.5 million. Confiscated the previous night from co-conspirator Stephen Arrington near Van Nuys Airport. The surveillance tape shows DeLorean examining the suitcase. His words, captured clearly on the recording, "It's better than gold." He lifted a glass of champagne. "A lot of success for everyone." Moments later, a man entered the room. "Hi, John. I'm Jerry West from the FBI. You're under arrest for narcotics smuggling violations." DeLorean appeared bewildered. He was arraigned at 2 p.m. Pacific, time before US Magistrate Volney Brown on 8 felony counts. Hours before the arrest, and this timing matters, the British government had already announced it would shut the factory. Cork had contacted DeLorean's New York office, confirmed the financing was incomplete, and immediately shut down DMC Limited, sending its remaining 35 employees home. His own son would later summarise the whole improbable arc of his father's life with a candour that bordered on dark comedy. "It's got cocaine, hot chicks, sports cars, bombed-out buildings, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, FBI agents, hardcore drug dealers." He wasn't wrong, but for 2,500 people in West Belfast, it wasn't a film pitch. It was the end of the only good thing that had ever happened to them. Chapter 11. The gates were locked. Production had ceased entirely at Dunmurry at the end of May 1982. The receivership had kept a skeleton operation alive, a diminishing hope, but hope nonetheless. After the arrest, even that vanished. On the 25th of October, DMC of America filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In November and December, the factory was formally closed. Consolidated International, parent company of Big Lots, headed by Sol A. Schenck, purchased approximately 1,374 unsold DeLoreans plus distribution rights. They also acquired roughly 2,500 cars total and 150 trailer loads of parts. A small group of workers was brought back to complete approximately 100 partially assembled cars still on the line. Then the gates closed for good. The BBC documentary Car Crash captured the accounts. Workers left out in the cold on the bad side of locked gates. RTE filmed the mood in those final days. We'll just have to see how it works out today at this meeting. Hopefully we'll get some sort of verdict tomorrow. After that, who knows? The dole again. One former worker. "The moment we heard the news, we knew the game was up, the dream over. They left the same day." Another. "How could we even stay there after that?" A third. "It was back to normal after that. Back to Belfast. Back to Belfast." 3 words that carried the weight of everything. Back to the city where male unemployment in their neighbourhoods ran at 40 to 50%. Back to the troubles, which wouldn't end for another 16 years. Back to the sectarian geography the factory had briefly allowed them to transcend. The oasis was gone, the desert remained. The government controversially sequestrated £990,000 from the DeLorean Workers' Pension Fund. Historian Nick Sutton called it an act of unbelievable spite. The people who had lost their jobs, their purpose, and, for many of them, their only experience of employment, also lost a portion of the modest retirement savings that had been building during those brief, bright months. Colin Chapman died of a heart attack on the 16th of December 1982, aged 54, at Ketteringham Hall, the Team Lotus base. Just 2 months after DeLorean's arrest. His death was devastating for prosecutors. At DeLorean's 1986 fraud trial, the prosecution could not disprove DeLorean's claim that the GPD money was a legitimate personal loan from Chapman. The dead man couldn't testify. Fred Bushell pleaded guilty to fraud in 1992 and was sentenced to 3 years, with an additional year for inability to pay fines. The judge, Lord Justice Murray, stated that Chapman would have received at least 10 years for what he called barefaced, outrageous, and massive fraud. The cocaine trafficking trial ran from the 18th of April to the 16th of August, 1984, in U.S. Federal Court, Los Angeles, before Judge Robert Takasugi. Defense attorneys Howard Weitzman and Donald Rhee argued entrapment. The evidence favoured them. Carol Winkler's call logs proved Hoffman initiated contact. Agent Teeser admitted the government had funded DeLorean's participation because he couldn't raise the money himself. Teeser confessed to rewriting and destroying original case notes. "I may have rewrote the pages," he told the court. Hoffman was shown on tapes drinking heavily and making lewd comments. Weitzman's closing. "This case is a sick case. It is a tragedy and a travesty of justice." Prosecutor James P. Walsh Jr. called DeLorean a man with the conscience of a tomcat. After 29 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted DeLorean of all 8 charges. Jurors said they believed he had been entrapped. DeLorean's statement: "Hopefully, this terror that my family and I have gone through, this horror that we've gone through for the last almost 2 years now, won't have been wasted." His famous quip, "Would you buy a used car from me?" The US fraud trial in Detroit in October 1986 saw him acquitted of 15 counts of fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. He successfully fought extradition to the United Kingdom. When he died in 2005, the Crown still had an outstanding warrant for his arrest. The parliamentary reckoning was as close to a verdict as the British system could deliver. The Public Accounts Committee's 25th report, debated in the Commons on the 1st of May 1985, motion moved by John Major, then Financial Secretary to the Treasury, used language unprecedented in its severity. One of the gravest cases of the misuse of public resources to come before us for many years. A shocking misappropriation of public and private money. Hardly any of those who dealt with Mr. DeLorean on behalf of the British taxpayer at a high level can escape substantial blame or criticism. Conservative MP Michael Grills. A scandalous lack of attention to the background of the people who were entrusted with taxpayers' money. SDPMP Neville Sandelson. I never doubted that this was money down the drain. Total cost to the taxpayer: approximately £77 million. The government eventually recovered £21 million from auditors Arthur Anderson after 12 years of litigation, settled in 1997, plus £4.67 million from Chapman's estate. The net loss, roughly £51 million. For that money, the United Kingdom got 2 years of car production, 9,000 vehicles, and a generation of Belfast workers who were given hope and then had it taken away. Chapter 12. What remains? Nick Sutton's verdict is the one that settles last and stays longest. The losers in this saga were not John DeLorean, who was declared bankrupt in 1999, or the management team, many of whom found other jobs. It was the 2,500 employees at Dunmurry. Many of them never worked again. They returned to neighbourhoods where employment was the exception, not the rule, where the troubles would continue for another 16 years, where the skills they'd learned, assembling gull-wing doors, fitting stainless steel panels, wiring French V6 engines into Italian-designed chassis on English-engineered backbone frames, had no application whatsoever. The factory had been an anomaly, a glittering interruption in lives otherwise shaped by division, unemployment, and the low expectations that come with both. When it ended, the world it briefly replaced was still there, waiting. DeLorean himself spent his remaining years in a long, quiet diminishment. He tried to develop a plastic sports car. It never materialized. He was working on DeLorean Time, luxury watches, when he died. Declared bankrupt in 1999. His Bedminster estate was purchased by Donald Trump and converted into a golf course. His Fifth Avenue duplex was sold. At the time of his death, his net worth was reportedly under $1 million. He married Sally Baldwin in 2002. They had a daughter, Sheila. He described himself as a born-again Christian and told Playboy magazine, "I think my ultimate sin, and it was really terrible, was that I had this insatiable pride. Looking back at it, I see that I had an arrogance that was beyond that of any other human being alive." He died on the 19th of March 2005, aged 80, of complications from a stroke at Overlook Hospital, Summit, New Jersey. Only a handful of people attended the funeral. His ashes were interred at Whitechapel Memorial Park Cemetery in Troy, Michigan, with full military honours. His tombstone features a DeLorean with gull-wing doors open. Christina Ferrari stood by him through the cocaine trial. She filed for divorce after the acquittal, not during the crisis, but after it. The breaking point, as she later described it, she confronted him with a Time magazine cover featuring his legal troubles. He smiled and said, "Half the fun of losing money was getting it back." The divorce was granted in 1985. She married ABC television executive Tony Tomopoulos 2 weeks later. And the car that was a commercial disaster and a critical disappointment and a punchline, became immortal. Director Robert Zemeckis and writer Bob Gale originally conceived the Back to the Future time machine as a refrigerator. They worried children might lock themselves inside fridges, imitating the film. With DeLorean's legal troubles dominating the news, Zemeckis suggested the car instead. Ford offered substantial money for product placement to use a Mustang. Zemeckis refused. The DeLorean's eccentric character matched Doc Brown perfectly. 3 years after the factory went dark, Hollywood turned the car nobody wanted into the most famous movie vehicle in cinema history. The hero car was added to the National Historic Vehicle Register in 2021. DeLorean's daughter Kat said, "It was the perfect choice, but at the time I really hated that movie and the car." Approximately 6,500 DeLoreans survive today. Average collector value, around $64,000, with the highest recorded sale at $243,000. Stephen Wynn, a Liverpool-born mechanic, founded the DeLorean Motor Company of Texas in 1995, in Humble, Texas, acquiring all remaining parts inventory, roughly 4 million original components. Catherine DeLorean, John's daughter, is now chief executive of DeLorean Next Generation Motors. In 1989, French automotive supplier Montupet began manufacturing cast aluminium cylinder heads at the Dunmurry site. In 2015, Canadian manufacturer Linamar Corporation acquired Montupet. The facility became Linamar Light Metals Belfast, producing cast and machined aluminium parts for Audi, BMW, Ford, GM, and Renault-Nissan. It employs approximately 600 people. Some original factory buildings remain, repurposed. The test track survives. No formal plaque or memorial marks the DeLorean era. In June 2024, the DeLorean Owners Association of the United Kingdom and Ireland organised the DeLorean Revival at the Dunmurry site. 62 gleaming DeLoreans, each now worth more than a Belfast terraced house, slowly circled the overgrown test track of the factory where they were born. Driven by enthusiasts from as far away as California, polished to a mirror finish, gull-wing doors rising in unison for photographs. The workers who actually built them weren't there. The cars came home. The people who made them didn't. Some because they'd moved on. Some because they'd grown old. Some because for them, that factory, those 28 months between the bog and the silence, remained the best thing that ever happened to them, and returning to it as a spectator at a car show was a different kind of loss altogether. The building still stands. Repurposed, renamed, producing components for companies those original workers would never have heard of. The stainless steel they shaped by hand is scattered across 6,500 garages and collections worldwide, appreciating in value with every passing year. And the silence inside the building where the work used to be, the work that briefly made Catholics and Protestants forget which gate they'd walked through, that gave young men and women from Twinbrook and Seymour Hill the first wage packet of their lives, that allowed 2,500 people in the most hopeless corner of Western Europe to build something beautiful and impractical, and theirs, that silence is still there. Silence is. It's just that nobody talks about it much anymore. They talk about the car,